All right, we're going to continue our study in Daniel tonight, and before we begin, let's have a word of prayer together. Our blessed Father in heaven, we're so thankful for you and for all that you give us. We're thankful for your word that is constant and sure, even when all other sources of wisdom seem to fail. Father, we know that your word is the true source of all knowledge and insight. We pray, Father, this evening that as we consult the Scriptures, as we look into your Word, and we read the words of your prophet Daniel, that you'll help us to apply them to our lives, to understand their implications for us, and to grow in our knowledge and in our faith of you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. Now, we're still kind of covering some introductory material in Daniel, and I mean, we could probably talk for a long time about introductory stuff, but I'm just going to make this the last class in introduction and not bog us down too much in that. We talked about the historical period and the scope of his visions and the different empires. You know, the major empires, of course, being the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. And that we'll have more to say about that in a couple of weeks when we get to Daniel chapter 2. But one other thing to be aware of is a unique feature of the Greek Empire is, did it stay a single empire the whole time it existed? No, it did not. What happened? Well, Alexander died, and he left the empire to his generals, basically. Yeah, it didn't really go to his sons. He was fairly young when he died, actually. It went to 4 of his generals. I'm not sure, actually. I have to look that up. It went to his generals, and it was kind of divvied up among 4 of his generals. And they are Lysimachus, Cassander, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. Although there's a bit more of a complicated story to it than that. The Bible's giving us the Cliff Notes version and saying it was 4 guys. The reality is it was reduced to 3 fairly quickly. And in fact, some history books you read will even say that the Greek Empire broke into 3 parts just because of how fast number 4 fell off. And in the book of Daniel, there are 2 in particular that are of supreme importance. And if you look in the maps, I included 3 different maps in this booklet. Did everybody get a booklet? Oh, Peggy did not get a booklet. Okay, yeah, there's 3 different maps in the booklets. The first one is a map of course, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And then the second is a map of the Persian Empire, which you'll notice is much, much bigger, and which stretches all the way from Egypt to almost as far as India, actually. And, the fun fact, when I go to India, they're always pointing out the fact that India is mentioned in the Bible in one place, in the book of Esther, when it talks about the extent of Xerxes' empire. And so that's the Persian Empire. But then the third map is not so much the Greek kingdom as it is the kingdom of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Because for the book of Daniel, it is those 2 kings, Ptolemy and Seleucus, who really kind of become the important players. And what happened was Seleucus took control of more of the eastern regions, the northern regions. So you see he's got a good chunk of Turkey, he's got Armenia, he's got Syria, and he's got Persia. Whereas the Ptolemies are pretty much all concentrated in Egypt and North Africa. And, of course, right smack dab in the middle between those 2 kings is Israel, right? And so naturally, like pretty much the rest of the history of the ancient Near East, the Levant, Israel becomes a war zone between everybody, and usually the people who get caught in the middle wind up losing on that exchange. Well, the book of Daniel talks quite a bit about the struggle between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids for control of that region, which is kind of interesting because Daniel's written, in connection with the reign of the Babylonian kings and the Persian kings. But Daniel's speaking about this very specific Greek conflict. And chapter 11, I know that, not many people here said they had studied the book of Daniel in depth before. How many of us have actually outright just read the whole book through? Okay, yeah, read it through. All right, now how many of you got to chapter 11 and went, what? Huh? Because there's all this business of the king of the north, the king of the south, the king of the north will do this, and the king of the south will do this, and you're reading and you're like, what? Huh? And the reality is that it's actually a very specific, detailed description of this Ptolemy-Seleucid conflict, is what it is. The king of the north would be Seleucus on that map, and the king of the south would be Ptolemy. And I think I've indicated some of this in the booklet and the timelines, but from about 300 to 200, basically from the time there were Greek rulers to about 200 BC, the Ptolemies controlled Palestine. And there was, the Ptolemies weren't very well liked in Palestine. Maybe their taxes were too high or something. Well, then, at some point, the Seleucids came along, and one of the Seleucid rulers was a guy named Antiochus III. He was known as Antiochus the Great, and he liked to conquer stuff. And so he would conquer everything that was in his path. He did not conquer Egypt, but he did manage to conquer Palestine. He took it away from the Ptolemies. And the Jews Josephus writes about how the Jews welcomed him as some kind of liberator. Antiochus III died, and then Seleucus IV ruled, and then Antiochus IV ruled. They're not very creative about naming their children in either the Ptolemies or the Seleucids. I'm not kidding. Actually, if you look in this book, I have a timeline of rulers, and it's the page that looks like this in your book. It's a timeline of rulers, and on one side it tells you the Ptolemies, Ptolemy the First, Ptolemy the Second, Ptolemy the Third, all the way down to Ptolemy the Sixth. And then on the other side, Seleucus the First, Antiochus the First, Antiochus the Second, Seleucus the Second, back and forth, back and forth. And these aren't the only Seleucuses and Antiochuses there is. These are just the ones that became king. So, there's also several Cleopatras. There's also it's all a whole mess. The ancient people did this kind of stuff. I guess they really like to use the same name over and over and over and over. Antiochus IV had a nickname too that he gave himself on his coins. He called himself Epiphanes. He was the God-made manifest. He was a little bit full of himself, and he was also a very bad man because he eventually tried to persecute the Jews in Palestine, and he outlawed Judaism at one point. He defiled the temple by setting up an altar to Zeus and sacrificing pigs and trying to get the Jews to eat pigs. And it really just kind of messed everything up. Antiochus was probably... The persecution from Antiochus is probably the closest that the Jewish culture has ever come to actually being physically exterminated. And that's... the Holocaust may have killed more people in terms of the numbers in the recent memory, but Antiochus was one who actually came close to obliterating Judaism as an entity. But of course it didn't work. He wound up dying. The Jews got their temple back. There's also the Maccabean revolt that kind of happened around the same time, where Judas Maccabeus, the hammer, decided to lead this revolt against Antiochus. And you can read books like First Maccabees and Second Maccabees, which are books outside the Bible that will talk about that kind of stuff. And of course, this whole series of events is the stories that also lead up to the Jewish feast of Hanukkah, which is it's not very well known what the point of Hanukkah is. It's been so heavily commercialized, but Hanukkah was their feast of... The word Hanukkah means dedication. It was to commemorate the fact that they were rededicating their temple after Antiochus defiled it. They wanted it back. They wanted to rededicate it. And of course the story goes that they didn't have enough oil to light the lamps. They only had enough oil for one day, and the oil miraculously extended into 8 days, and so they celebrate 8 days of Hanukkah as a result of that. And that's why, they got the menorah symbol to remind us of the lampstand. There's a whole... It's a very interesting story and a very interesting tradition. But Daniel talks about a lot of the prehistory leading up to that, which is what's so interesting about him. And that puts people in a little bit of a difficult position when it comes to the book of Daniel, because Daniel When was Daniel written? Yes, that's where we're getting to, right? All right, now obviously Mark is doing his sarcastic, blatantly wrong answer thing again. Well, yeah. Or one of the see that's the great thing about being sarcastically wrong is that if you were being serious and you were actually wrong, you can just play it off as sarcasm. But well, and to be fair, we don't know when the Old Testament was officially completed. I mean, there's a lot of argument about that. There's a lot of back and forth and hammering. We don't know who wrote certain books of the Bible. We have no clue who wrote Chronicles, for instance, or when it was finished. It has to be finished. Well, and that's where we're going. Well, that's where we're going on this as far as manuscript evidence goes. Yes, Jed. Oh, of course. Well, okay, and that brings us to this discussion of the date of Daniel. Well, obviously the critical scholar who denies that Daniel was written when it says it was written would also probably deny that Nebuchadnezzar actually wrote it and claim that somebody was just affixing his name. Now, this is I was hesitant to bring this make this a topic of discussion in class, but ultimately what swayed me on this is the fact that this viewpoint is there's two views on the date of Daniel out there. One view says that Daniel was written while the Persians were ruling everything, which makes sense because, Daniel mentions the Persians. He talks about how he was in Babylon until the Persians came. The narrative describes events that, like in Daniel 6, when Daniel's thrown in the lion's den. That's after the Persians have had their conquest. So, Daniel could have been finished around that time frame. But the other view, was what we call the late date of Daniel, holds this idea that no, Daniel was not written anywhere near the Persian time. It was written in the Greek period, and the late date of Daniel is so precise about this, it was written in 165 BC. Now, on the third Friday, why 165 BC? I will tell you why they say that. Because when you read Daniel chapter 11, there's a point where it's describing events, and then there's a point where it gets kind of weird and they can't correlate it with the history anymore, at least not comfortably. And that's the point at which they say, okay, he stopped writing history and now he's trying his hand at real prophecy. And he got it wrong. And so they claim that's the late date of Daniel. I am not convinced by the late date of Daniel. There's a lot of arguments that people have made. Some of them involve linguistics. Look, he uses Greek words in the book of Daniel, which sounds impressive until you realize that, number one, so what? The Greeks had contact with the Persians, even in that time period. And number two, there's only 3 undisputed examples, and they're all musical instruments. How many people in this room speak fluent Italian? Nobody? Nobody here speaks Italian? What? How many of you know what a piano is? Oh, everybody knows what a piano is, right? Well, why? Because we borrow words from other languages to describe things, even if we're not fluent in that language. And so, the Greek language didn't have to be well known at all for them to be using words for instruments. So that's not a very convincing argument. Now, there's a lot of the story of how the Old Testament came to be is this big compositional discussion about when everything was written down. And there's a lot of arguments and ideas. And most of them were cooked up in the 18th century during the Enlightenment, when people finally started to, supposedly started to believe in rationalism. But the date of Daniel is not a controversy that emerged in the 18th century. It is something that's far older. And in fact, it goes all the way back to a guy named Porphyry. Porphyry was a Greek philosopher. He was a Greek or Roman philosopher, I forget which. He was a Neoplatonic philosopher. And he lived about 3 centuries after Christ. And he wrote a 15-volume work called Against the Christians. So you can tell what direction this is going. We do not have Porphyry's 15-volume work Against the Christians because it's been destroyed. Constantine banned the work, and one of his successors, Theodosius II, commanded that that every copy be burned. So somewhere between 435 and 448 AD, all copies of Against the Christians ceased to exist. So we don't actually know what Porphyry said. But we do know, based on people who quoted him, that he didn't like the book of Daniel. And what Porphyry claimed, according to Jerome, in his 12th book, he wrote his 12th book against the prophet Daniel, denying it was composed by him whose name it bears, but rather by someone who was in Judea in the time of Antiochus. Now, here's the impressive thing about Porphyry. Porphyry will he concedes that, yes, Daniel 11 is describing events that really happened. It is describing things that are historically accurate. Now, if you read Daniel 11, you're kind of like, this is cryptic. And I tell you, oh, it's the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. You're like, well, that seems kind of contrived, but okay, I'll take your word for it. But see, the thing is, Porphyry thought the same thing. He thought, yes, this is about the Ptolemies. Yes, this is about the Seleucids. No, it's not prophecy. He concedes that it was historically accurate. He just didn't think it was predictive. And he coined the term ex eventu, the prophecy that was written after the event. And that the Jews and the Christians, they were just trying to trick you and pass it off as real prophecy. Now, Porphyry wasn't really accepted in his time, but some other folks in the 18th century thought, hey, that sounds like a great idea. And so today, if you go to a major university and you take a class and they talk about the book of Daniel in that class, it's going to be the late date of Daniel you hear. If you go to like some major, unless you're going to a seminary where people believe in predictive prophecy, or you go to like Florida College or one of these other Bible type schools, if you go to a secular university, they're going to tell you, yeah, Daniel was written in the 2nd century, in 165 BC. Now, how do we answer that? What? Okay, that's a good question to ask. What would be Daniel's motive in lying? Well, I mean, and sometimes what they will say is, well, some of the more moderate ones, they won't say Daniel was lying. They'll just say, oh, well, this was acceptable. This was an acceptable way of wrong. Which, this is kind of mind-boggling to me. The idea that, oh, well, he can pretend to write predictive prophecy and then try his hand at actual prophecy that fails. We have a problem with this, though, okay? How does a book get to be in the Bible? How did a book get to be in the Bible? Did God just drop a gold-plated list out of heaven and say, these are the books that are in the Bible, go for it? Is that what happened? Now, see, well, yeah, that's a familiar strategy if you remember from the world religions class. But is that the way God did it? Right. All right. All right. Okay, yeah, so there's a sense in which we're recognizing the works as intrinsically canonical. Jen? Last great prophet. No, well, let's think about the timeline of events. Mark said something about copies of the Old Testament, and I want to kind of set the record straight on that. Okay, all right. So here's the timeline. We got about 1000 AD over here, and we'll put the cross here, 33 AD. At some point we go from transition to the year 0. Except there was no year 0, it was 1 BC and 1 AD. And they weren't counting them with BC and AD back then. I'm using modern Gregorian methods. But, okay, and so way over here, you got like... Alright, so you got 500 BC, which, for simplicity's sake, we'll pigeonhole that around the time Daniel was written. Okay, now for a long time, The earliest copies of the Old Testament were where on this timeline? That we had. Anybody want to take a guess? For a very long time, like, years and years and years, huh? Nope. Try this. For a long time, those were the earliest copies of the Old Testament we had in Hebrew. Now, we had some earlier ones in Greek, but nobody liked to read the Greek stuff, so because it was a translation or something. But the Hebrew Old Testament, it's like, that was the earliest stuff we had. What do we do? Oh no. Well, that was what we went on. And, if you're reading an ASV or King James Version, it's translated from manuscripts from that time period. Actually, pretty much every Bible still is translated from manuscripts from that time period. But we're getting the good bit. In the 1940s, they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are kind of cool because the Dead Sea Scrolls kind of date to this area. So we'll say kind of the 200 to 200. Which is kind of cool. I'm approximating. What? Well, yeah, the problem is it's hard to tell when a manuscript was written. You know why? Because they didn't put dates on it. It's not like when you write checks. And even then, you get the year wrong when you write your check. So, exactly, they don't do that. Yeah, usually if that happens, they're forging it. But you can guesstimate when a manuscript was written, though, by looking at the calligraphy. Because people change the way they write over time. It's like if you ever open up an old King James Bible and the S's look like F's. Yeah. So you can tell if you open up any book and the S's look like F's that that's from way back in that period. Because people write differently over time. Handwriting changes over time. Soon people will stop writing cursive, and then, if you find a document in cursive, you'll be like, well, that wasn't written in this millennium, or something like that. People will say that eventually, I'm sure. But anyhow, the 200 to 200 BC to AD, the Dead Sea Scrolls had a lot of cool stuff in it. Had a lot of Hebrew manuscripts, had a lot of Greek manuscripts, had a lot of Aramaic manuscripts, and quite a bit of Daniel is found there. And some pretty good Daniel is found dating to, I don't want to get the date wrong. What date did I have written here? Alright, now the absolute latest they have been able to get the final Daniel manuscript they got is 115 BC. And you might say, oh, well, that's still after 165. So they had, 50 years to get this thing circulated, right? Except, here's an interesting curiosity about, this is the way scholarly people think. Whenever a manuscript is found to be accepted as canonical, they automatically assume that it must have existed for a lot longer. And that is the case. For a long time it was chic for scholars to say, well, the Psalms were written in the Maccabean period, Ecclesiastes was written in the Maccabean period, Chronicles was written in the Maccabean period. They want to push it all into the Greek period. So much of the Old Testament. Well, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, they started revising their timeline and changing everything. And that's the great thing. When you kick over a rock, your whole scheme for how everything came about gets revised. This is our little crash course in how we got the Bible. And so I'll just read you some quotes from scholars, ivory tower scholar types, regarding the Psalms. Frank Cross has indicated that one of the Psalms manuscripts from Cape 4 attests so-called Maccabean Psalms at a period which is roughly contemporary with their supposed composition. If this is true, it would seem that we should abandon the idea of any of the canonical Psalms being of Maccabean date, for each song had to win its way in the esteem of the people before it could be included in the sacred compilation of the Psalter. Immediate entry for any one of them is highly improbable. They're saying, it couldn't be Greek, you gotta push it back. You gotta push it back. We found it in that time block, we gotta push it back. Ecclesiastes, same thing. The script for 2 scrolls of Ecclesiastes found in Cape 4 indicates a date near the middle of the 2nd century BC. That's the manuscript. This is not much later than the time at which many scholars have thought that the book was originally written. We cannot tell, of course, how old the book was when this particular copy was made, but the probability of its composition in the 3rd century, if not earlier, is somewhat enhanced by finding the manuscript probably not written much after 150 BC. So we got to push it back at least another 100 years. Chronicles, my personal favorite, the discovery of a fragment of Chronicles at Qumran, that's where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, renders a Maccabean date virtually impossible for any part of Chronicles. Alright, so they find Chronicles, they find Chronicle manuscripts in this time period, they say you gotta go back. They find Ecclesiastes manuscripts in this period, say you gotta go back. They find Psalm manuscripts in this period, you gotta go back. That it had to have been written further in the past than here. They find a Daniel manuscript from this period, still written in 165. That makes sense to you? It makes sense to you? It doesn't make sense to me. No. Exactly. Still written in 165. Why? It has to be. That's the thing. If you date Daniel before 165 BC, you have all kinds of problems for the naturalistic worldview. You have to admit that predictive prophecy is a real thing. Exactly. Now, I'll just be upfront. I don't normally, when I'm talking about evidences with people, I go for the resurrection of Jesus. I think the historical evidence for that is the best case you can make for the faith. And I think that really, that argument alone is sufficient. So, to me, I don't really have a dog in the fight of proving that predictive prophecy is a thing. But, either Daniel was written when it says it was, or everything's going crazy. And frankly, if your only reason for dating Daniel to 165 is, well, it just couldn't happen, then we've got a problem. Because this is the entire message of this book is what? What is the message of this book of Daniel? It's about Jesus. What does it teach us about God? God is in control of what? Kingdoms, the rise and fall of kingdoms, outcome of the earth, Lord of history. You want to tell me that a book that's so rooted in this idea of Lord of history is fabricated based on all these different lies? Okay, you want to say that, but then don't come along and say, oh, well, this would have been acceptable. It's not acceptable. Don't pay lip service to Daniel's theology. Don't pay lip service, oh, what a great literary product this book is, and then turn around and say, well, he was faking the whole thing. That doesn't work that way. So, it's similar, and that's what this is really about. And to this day, you got a lot of predictive prophecy in Daniel. You got chapter 7 with the 4 beasts and the 4 world kingdoms. You got chapter 8 where the ram is Medo-Persia and the goat is Greece, and they explicitly name them. You got Daniel's 70 weeks, which are predictive, although it's hard to figure out what exactly they are predicting, and there's not a lot of agreement on that. But then you got chapter 11, and Daniel chapter 11 is a thorn in the side of anybody who says predictive prophecy is not a thing. It is, and the problem is ultimately, when you read Porphyry and you read guys like that who say that, it is talking about history. And it is so much that way, in fact, that Daniel 11 has been used by people trying to reconstruct the history of the Greek period as a historical source when they don't have anything else to go on. That is how good it is. But Daniel wasn't written during the Greek period, was it? And this is, I think, the real reason here. Because if we accept the early date of Daniel, if we accept that Daniel was written in the Persian times, then we have to admit that predictive prophecy is a thing. And thus we have to probably admit that there's a God, and they have to admit a lot of other stuff. And that's going to create a lot of problems if you think that there is no God, or that it's all or that there's no supernatural. So that's basically. There's another fascinating issue that goes into this, and that's the question of historical accuracy. Sometimes people charge that Daniel's not historically accurate, and for a long time, the target of historical criticism was a king named Belshazzar. Anybody familiar with... I've probably talked about this before, but Belshazzar is the king mentioned in Daniel chapter 5. And if you read, it was really popular for years and years and years for critics to deny that Belshazzar ever existed. Because if you read the Greek historians, you know that Belshazzar wasn't ever a king. You never heard, he's not even mentioned in the Greek histories. Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon, if you read the Greek histories. And so people for years thought, well, Daniel 5's just making stuff up. Now, there were some believers who tried to argue that Belshazzar and Nabonidus were actually the same man. Josephus does that. Right. Well, then, in the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, they start finding archaeological evidence. In 1924, the Nabonidus cylinder was translated, and new information came to light, and lo and behold, we find out, no, Belshazzar was a person. Turns out he was a king. He wasn't the only king. He was co-regent with his father, Nabonidus. And because he was the Nabonidus Chronicle details how Nabonidus had to spend a lot of time away from Babylon. He let Belshazzar handle the bulk of the city's administrations. There's a whole thing about how Nabonidus had this big conflict going on with the priests of Marduk. They didn't really... they didn't get along for some reason. The exact details are sketchy. But the end result, of course, is that Nabonidus didn't spend any time in Babylon. He left the city in his son's hands, Belshazzar. Which, of course, in Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5 keeps offering the handwriting appears on the wall, and Belshazzar says, that'll be, well, anyone who can read this, explain it, will become third ruler in the kingdom. Makes sense, right? He can't say second ruler in the kingdom because he's the second ruler in the kingdom. Nabonidus is first. So what's interesting about this then, all the Greek historians, they never even mentioned Belshazzar. They're just unaware of him. Right? Daniel mentions Belshazzar. So if Daniel was written in 165 in the Greek period, that means Daniel knew something that no other Greek historian that we have knew at the time. That Belshazzar was a king. Every other Greek historian seems to have forgotten about him, at least the ones that we have. But Daniel seems to be fully well aware of him. Now, there is another historical figure in Daniel for whom we do not have any outside confirmation, and that is Darius the Mede, who is mentioned in Daniel 6, and who's the king in the famous story where Daniel gets thrown in the lion's den. And we don't have a character in history that easily corresponds with Darius the Mede, although you have a lot of suggestions. I don't know which of the suggestions is correct. We might go over them later. I don't know. I have to decide if that's relevant. But if somebody comes along and says, well, Daniel's not historically accurate because it's making up guys like Darius the Mede, what do we say to that? Somebody comes along, you say, oh, Daniel, look at Daniel. Daniel was a really cool example of predictive prophecy. And they say, oh, that wasn't written when it says it was. Look at Darius. He's not even a real person. No, Daniel just made up characters. How do you respond to somebody who says something like that? That is what they said about Belshazzar, isn't it? It's an argument from silence. And you know the thing about arguments from silence? They're subject to fall overnight. Just like Belshazzar. Both the argument about him and actual Belshazzar. They fall overnight. And that's the great thing about that. Is just because you don't have any evidence of something doesn't mean anything in particular. We didn't have any evidence that all this stuff at Qumran existed until some shepherd boy was throwing rocks in the Dead Sea region and found it. We don't have, and now, this changed the landscape of how they chronologically find stuff. So technically, all that's needed to destroy an argument from silence in archaeology is somebody kicks over the right rock. That's the issue. So, ultimately, it's if that's the best shot that they've got, is denying the historicity of Darius the Mede, then, there's not much there. There's, let's see, historical accuracy, manuscript evidence. I'm not going to get into linguistic stuff. ask this question. All right, we talked about what the book of Daniel is about. Daniel is kind of... What kind of a book is Daniel, I guess? I might ask. If you're going to name the different parts of the Old Testament. When you say your books of the Old Testament, how do you divide them up? What categories do you have? You have the law. You have the poetry. What else? Prophecy. History. There you go. Yeah, exactly. In your English Bible, you have the law, the history, the poetry, and the prophets. And you get major and minor prophets. And that's your English Bible. And in your English Bible, Daniel is in the prophets, right where you expect him, right? Which makes sense because he's a prophet. All right? But you may remember, I talk about this occasionally, that the Hebrew Bible did it differently. They divvied it up differently. They had the law, they had the prophets, and they had that third category called the writings. And it gets confusing to us. It's all the same books, but the prophets included their histories because prophets weren't just predictors of the future, they were guys that wrote history. So Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are all prophets, along with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, which is really just all 12 minor prophets in one book. Okay, so that's the prophets. Where does Daniel come in this scheme now? He comes in the writings, alongside Psalms, Proverbs, Esther, Ruth, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, books like that. Daniel comes along there. And so Daniel is kind of thought to be the odd duck. And some people have looked at that and they said, aha, the Jews didn't put Daniel in the prophets, so they must not have thought he was really a prophet. What do you think of that? What do you think of that reasoning? Everybody's just giving me the puzzled look, like who is he running into that says these things? Was Daniel a prophet? Well, yeah. How do we know he was a prophet? Daniel 11. Okay, yeah, that's true. All right. What is a prophet? Let's ask that. What is a prophet? That's a pretty basic question. Okay. A person who speaks for God. Now, in our modern vernacular, when people say prophet, they think what you just said. Somebody, they predict the future. This Nostradamus type, looking into the future events. But most of the prophets didn't do that. I mean, occasionally they'd say, God's going to smite you, which sounds future predictory. But in reality, all they had to do to get that conclusion was read the book of Deuteronomy. Oh, look, you're sinning. Guess what? Deuteronomy says God's going to smite you. What happened oftentimes is the prophets were guys who would show up and say, you're in breach of contract. They were kind of the covenant lawyers for God, his prosecuting attorneys. They were the historians, right? And so prophets would preach about the covenant, the people, and they'd interpret Israelite history. Now, Daniel actually kind of fits the modern definition of a prophet quite a bit, because he does way more future predicting than like anybody. And what most of the Old Testament prophets, you read Isaiah, Jeremiah, they're talking in poetry. They're using a lot of they're making a lot of vague, poetic-ish descriptions, predictions. But Daniel doesn't contain a lot of poetry, and he doesn't really contain a lot of judgment oracles either. In fact, he doesn't really seem to be addressing Israel that much. He addresses them a little bit in places. But the bulk of what Daniel has to say is directed at the Gentile nations to which he is in exile. So Daniel is really the foreteller as well as the forth-teller. Normally you think of prophets. Prophets are supposed to be forth-tellers rather than foretellers. That's the slogan that we always use. So can we call Daniel a prophet? Well, yeah. Because Jesus called him one in Matthew 24. And other people are called prophets even though they don't have books attached to them, like Abraham and David and Moses. Well, Moses has like 5 books attached to him. But Okay, and then this raises all kinds of questions. Why would, if Daniel is a prophet, they raise the question, why isn't he grouped with the prophets in the Hebrew Bible? Why did they group him differently? Was he grouped differently? I mean, so some of those manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, kind of challenge that notion a little bit. They treat him on par with Ezekiel and Isaiah. But I thought this quote was interesting, and you might find it interesting too. Josephus wrote, "From there we believe that Daniel conversed with God. For he did not only prophesy of future events, as did the other prophets, but he also determined the time of their accomplishment. And while prophets used to foretell misfortunes, and on that account were disagreeable both to kings and to the multitude, Daniel was to them a prophet of good things, and this to such a degree that by the agreeable nature of his predictions he procured the goodwill of all men, and by the accomplishment of them he procured the belief of their truth and the opinion of a sort of divinity for himself among the multitude." What Josephus is saying there is that, yeah, we actually do treat Daniel differently because he was way more specific than the other prophets. And because he said stuff we wanted to hear. Most of the prophets, you read Hosea or Amos, they're very doom and gloom. God's going to smite you. But Daniel doesn't do that so much. So, if Daniel is grouped differently, it isn't because the Jews thought less of him. It's because they thought more of him. If anything. For what it's worth. So sometimes people bring that up. But Daniel is definitely a prophet. And he is a prophet. He's a very different kind of prophet. A very unique prophet in some ways. We don't know anything about him outside of the book that bears his name. There is a Daniel that's mentioned in Ezekiel 14, which may be the same Daniel. Maybe not. I don't know. But ultimately, what is going on is, the authority he gets as a prophet seems to come from, seems to be recognized by the book that bears his name. Okay. I skipped a lot of stuff. Let's see. Okay. Well, ask ourselves another couple of things just to kind of be aware of. I provided an outline of the book in this opening page here. Outline of the book of Daniel. And really kind of grouped it into two major parts with an introduction. And the reason for this division, some people, they read Daniel, and Daniel 1 through 6 are stories, and Daniel 7 through 12 are apocalyptic visions, and so it's kind of like, well, there's your easy division, your easy outline right there. I did it a little differently on here, and there's a reason for it. Chapters 2 through 7 are pretty much mostly in Aramaic. And chapters 8 through 12 and chapter 1 are in Hebrew. Now, of course, you get them in English, so this distinction gets kind of walled off. But anybody else think that's a little weird for a book of the Bible? I mean, you don't do that with modern books. I mean, I don't go to the store, buy a novel, come home, and read the first chapter, it's in English, and then I get chapter 2, and the writer just decided to start writing in Spanish. Then you get and he keeps writing in Spanish until you get to chapter 7, and then he switches back to English. You're kind of like, what? Why would you do that? It's kind of like what Daniel does. Because chapter 1's in Hebrew, chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic, chapters 8 through 12 are in Hebrew again. And nobody really knows why. The biggest suggestion that's out there is, well, Aramaic was the imperial language, because chapters 2 through 7 are more addressed to the nations, the Gentiles, whereas chapters 8 through 12 are more addressed to Israel, which I've kind of reflected that in the outline here. God and the nations for chapters 2 through 7, God and Israel for chapters 8 through 12. And there's, of course, some structuring. You'll notice certain chapters are parallel with one another. Like chapters 2 and 7 both talk about 4 world kingdoms. Chapters 3 and 6 both talk about God saving somebody from a deathly situation. Whether it be a fiery furnace or whether it be a lion's den. And chapters 4 and 5 are about God humbling super proud kings who are too full of themselves, like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. In Nebuchadnezzar's case, God turns him into a beast of the field, and in Belshazzar's case, God just has him killed. And then chapters 8 through 12, there's 3 more visions. Chapter 8 is the ram and the goat, which describes the Maccabean crisis. Chapter 9 is the 70 weeks when Daniel prays a covenant prayer and God responds by talking about 70 weeks that were decreed for His people, which we will have more to say about that when we get to chapter 9. And chapters 10 through 12 is His one vision, and it's like the longest section of the book. Is again about the Maccabean crisis. Chapters 10 through 12 take up a quarter of the book. You think about that. One vision takes up a quarter of the book. And why we assign particular importance to the events in this vision, well, maybe we can form some ideas about that as we study the book of Daniel. That's all I have today by way of introduction. Does anybody have any thoughts, comments, or questions before we conclude? I know some of this stuff might get a little dry and a little different. But next time, read chapter 1. Look at the questions that are included in the handout. Maybe even try to answer them. And we'll meet next time and we'll talk about Daniel chapter 1 and see how Daniel acts when he's in the king's court. That's all for now.